I was hoping they could hear me. So, nah, I'm not going to start over my story. But, and so it got me thinking more about where can we take Zephyr from a project and from a community perspective. Now, we listened to or watched a couple of presentations before this, and I think, things like Twister and Twister 2, I suspect a number of people are using them. We use them internally too, to test on individual boards, to make sure we didn't break something before we push something out to as a PR. But I started thinking from a more global sense, because when that patch came in, we really didn't have a mechanism to find out if, is it testing everything in the tree, right? We've got, I hadn't done a recent count, but we've got a ton of boards out there, a ton of architectures and all that stuff. And so, I wanted a way to be able to know that. Now, there are various companies that have their own hardware test ranges. We have a test repo in which they upload their data, but it's really kind of dependent on each individual, I'd say community member or member company that happens to have it to do that. Even in my company, we have a hardware test range. It's shared by our SDK team, and I have to physically call the guy up or send him a message and say, and it's in Shanghai, and say, can you run a test, right? So I've discussed this a little bit with various individuals in the community about, is there something we can do about that particular piece? So before I go too far, let me just say that I look at the testing from multiple levels. There's the individual developer who's trying to test to make sure that nothing's broken, so you do all that stuff. There's the individual companies or collaborators that have built something, they're testing just on their board, and they care about their board. And then there's some vendors, like we're one of them, I would think. A lot of the semiconductor vendors probably fall into this place where they want to make sure that it works across all their boards and all their customer boards and stuff. So there's different scaling of testing that or quality determination that we would like to have. But let me first ask, the people here, how many people actively use Twister in their weekly, daily, whatever thing? So there's a lot of us here. I'll say, I personally don't use it that much because I have a VM on my box and it runs out of disk space if I try to run the whole suite. But I think.
You just asked a very different question. You asked who uses Twister, not who uses Twister to run the tests.
That's true. That's true.
It's a very different question.
Yes, that's true. So, the Twister 2 discussion is interesting because, I know all the problems he was saying about people coming in and wanting to add to it, it's very daunting. I've looked at it because there's things I wanted to do with it, and it's just like, oh, I don't have time to figure this out, right? So we all use Twister, and I think Twister, even in some of the things that I've been trying to figure out how to handle, is something that we may want to leverage. But one of the things I'm trying to get to is I would love to see a way for the project to somehow have a distributed testing framework, so that all of these various hardware ranges, Intel has a bunch of our boards, a bunch of STs, Nordics, their stuff. My hardware range has just our stuff on it. Nordic has a range. You guys ST probably has a range of some sort. But I'd like to see us get to a point where we had a distributed testing framework that the project can not necessarily manage, but contribute to to be able to send out jobs, to be able to collect jobs, and then to have the data end up in a way that anybody in the project can just immediately go to and see, right? Excuse me? A blockchain, yeah. Because, and then, and part of my logic here is that if, as a community member or as a member company that comes in, there's a vested interest to make sure that stuff works on my boards. And even if it's someone that comes in, they have only one board, that can contribute to the project. I mean, to the test results and stuff like that. I forget the gentleman's name from Goliath. Jonathan, yeah, Jonathan. Sorry, yeah, Jonathan. He's been looking into this as well, and he doesn't really have a proposal yet, and I don't even have a proposal on how to do this because I'm not aware of any frameworks that are readily available. But his position, and I think it's probably a good one, is we ought to, it should be open source. Because I think what happens is most companies get around to doing one because there's just not a viable solution out there. So it should be open source, and maybe even the project, it becomes like a sub-project of Zephyr, right? Because it's going to support Zephyr, and we put it out there.
I don't want to give up my secrets. I don't want to tell anybody what I'm doing. I can't.
Oh. Yeah, okay, so for people who have secret boards and stuff like that, yeah. I think, so when you run tests, and sometimes a test suite, I mean, a hardware range may not be up or something like that, I think that's okay. And if you don't want to put a board in yet until your secrets have been revealed, that's okay too. What I'm suggesting is that we have a framework so that we can build out this expanded hardware range to support Zephyr, to know more quickly when things have gone awry, or just to at least know when the quality is.
So I like the idea of a shareable hardware range or ranges. The dynamics of it coming and going, totally understandable. The need for hiding proprietary information, absolutely necessary for all of us. We must honor that. I've got a friend who's a functional safety engineer, and he shared a thought with me that's been puzzling in my mind for quite a while, which is he advocates removing all the bugs before the code ever sees the hardware. How would you like to minimize the need for testing on hardware?
Where's the Renode guys? I did not know that they had created some emulation based off of device tree, but yeah, I'm not even at all suggesting that this is the end all be all. There are, we've seen some presentations and discussions about emulation. You want to do, what's the term, software driven development. So you can, because a lot of times, a lot of these companies and it will have the hardware just not there yet, right? So you can do the same thing with software testing, and we do that on CI at some level, right? So we're running CI on a QEMU or whatever, and then we're running some subset of tests, and it's a balance. In that case, it's a balance. It's a time balance and a resource balance of how much we want to spend on the cloud.
Well, I was going to say on the, like this distributed hardware testing, we would need to establish criteria of like who gets to add something in, because we want to add in just kind of random boards that's not actually being supported by that member company. At what point does a one-off failing board block a release, right? Defining all those kind of criteria gets expensive. I'm certainly with Greg on doing more emulation, finding more bugs before you run it on hardware. And yeah, the cloud and the CI system gets expensive, but that's still way cheaper than hardware, running on hardware. So I think getting the community to move in a direction where we're doing more emulation testing is where we need to push things, and that can be, you know, with these kind of homegrown emulators that we're starting to do now. I think Renode system, I think, is really good to leverage as well.
Yeah, I was going to concur that I think we have to separate, you know, the sense of, you know, testing of whether it's core kernel functionality, you know, APIs for subsystems, things of that nature that we can test, you know, to, you know, Greg's point, to Keith's point of you know, finding the bugs before you're testing even on hardware, right? So there's a lot of stuff that we, you know, need to shift our mindsets, I think, to, and this is not to say that we don't have to test on hardware. Obviously, there are things that you're only going to see on hardware and so forth. But I do think that there's more burden, it's not more burden, but that there is an aspect of that which is the hardware providers' problem, in a sense. Not to say that we don't want to in the community or so forth, but at some level, you know, if NXP's got a buggy I2C driver, well, NXP should have tested that and hopefully figured that out and caught it and sort of deal with that internally. It's not something the project should have to, you know, ideally be looking, you know, trying to test for and so forth. We should be more concerned is, you know, if someone's making a change to the I2C API, or something, or to the subsystem, did that break something? Did that break everybody? Where we can use, you know, the emulation testing, you know, those type of things to catch those type of issues, hopefully, and so forth. So I do think there's kind of a balance there, and I think, you know, one of the points that Jonathan had made, we talked about this for those who weren't, you know, there and so forth, and Monday and Tuesday with the TSC was. What he's kind of came to realize as Goliath looked at the issue, and I think others are, you know, kind of have this anecdotally or know it, is it's very costly to run a board farm, a board range, just because there's a lot of you know, boards fail for one reason or another, right? Flashes, you've worn out the flash, the board's just flaky. There's a lot of cost associated with this, and I know I kind of proposed that we need to, as we think about this idea and look at this idea of having availability of running tests on hardware that people provide access to, of having it be a fault tolerant system, right? To be able to say, hey, you know, I may get a failure because I can't connect to the board, or that board is buggy, and how we kind of, you know, reconcile the data that we get back from the system such that we can sort of deal with a lot of those issues, as opposed to having the assumption that I think probably occurs more when you guys are, you know, in NXP or Nordic or others would be in testing in-house on hardware, where you're like, well, the hardware we have to assume is right, and if there is a bug, figuring out, okay, is that a faulty piece of hardware or not, or going, you know, figuring all that out.
So I think I agree with you guys that I'm always encouraging to test more on the emulators and simulators, and not only building for hardware, but to use the emulated solutions. But also on the other hand, hardware is also very important, but I'm not sure if it's so important, let's say on the PR basis, like every PR you have, then it will be impossible to make it working. But on the other hand, if we have, I think we might just get a more involvement in this daily testing on target, because there was this test results repo, like you mentioned, and for results getting sent. And I have to admit that I also kind of stopped it at one point, because I wasn't sure if there is any kind of involvement in there, if this is used in any way. So, and it was taking a bit of time to just make sure it runs, to fix all the issues, to be sure that the results are not containing just the flakiness of the boards. So I think what I wanted to say that maybe if we invest a bit more in this test results repo to provide a more means for make it easier for companies to provide the results. So for example, like to automatize the process for sending the results. Right now you just require making a PR and taking it. And I was also looking to automatize it, but at one point I just stopped it because I had to switch to something else. But I think if we provide like tools for community, and also we discuss on the project level or with the management, like what would be the commitment. I think that might be a just good idea to bring it back and get more involvement and saying like, okay, so for example, for the releases, like the certain companies or certain boards then can have a like kind of a special status that the results are required. And of course, it will require certain commitment from the companies, but it will also make the release quality higher. That on the picture, I think, no, not you shown the someone else, where you see the table of what boards run which test. I think this is, yeah. No, not the one. The one with the JUnit to HTML, so the one with this test repo, test results. So I think this is the way to go.
Yeah, this test repo that we have, I mean, I think, so the testing working group now meets on Thursdays, I think, early morning. What? Oh, yeah. Yeah, they've moved around a bit, but I know they do it really early in the morning because some of the people involved with that are in China. So I think Intel pushes, they run a daily test, and so there's something being pushed to that daily. My company, Hake, does a test kind of ad hoc-ish. Right now, it's not on a set schedule. That's not a good thing, I think, generally speaking, but because, you know, to the point about buggy boards and stuff like that, what I'm more concerned about is I don't want the system to figure out where my bugs are. I want the system to tell me when something got broken when it used to work.
I'd be curious for us just to, you know, is it interesting as a starting point to expand what we have and allow like community members to contribute results, like, you know, make it easier, make it automated to give data into the system that's there, and then, you know, try to expose it to more people as well, to see, you know, are people interested in submitting from the community, right? So I get that there's going to be, you know, silicon vendors that have a vested interest in running on their silicon and having the results, but you know, we get a lot of contributions where so-and-so, you know, adds their board, or you have, you know, maybe a middleware player, or so, you know, like let's take, you know, Laird as an example, right? They're not building silicon, but they're building boards and systems, you know, or do they have an interest? Just to get even if the data says, hey, it didn't run on my board or whatever, just to start seeing, like, to be able to kind of mine that result without an interest first and foremost in what it is, but just to say, hey, can we collect enough data that we can say, okay, I see that, you know, for a good handful of boards, I either am getting consistent results, or for a good set of boards, I see that there's a lot of results, so I can throw out, you know, false positives or negatives or so forth, and say, oh, maybe that board's buggy, but I got results from 6 other boards from running this test and they all passed, right? So likely maybe there's something with that one, you know, just to see where we get without, you know, because I think that's kind of one of the aspects of this that I wonder about before trying to implement a full system and all this stuff, and you put a lot of engineering into it, and if it's only still like the 3 or 4, yeah, then it's kind of like, well, you know, why do we, you know, why do we do all that?
No, I agree, because that's the other thing is I have to understand. Hold on, let me just respond to this. I have to understand that you know, I have my own preferences and biases, but I also come to the project from a different angle, and it may be that the smaller, you know, company that's engaged that has one board, they've got their tests covered, right?
That, or just the sense of, you know, I'm just curious. I mean, like, I'd be curious to see if we made it easier, whether, hey, I've got an NXP board on my desk and I can just run this thing, and at night or whatever, like, hey, here's a quick way to set it up. It's going to go off and do the thing. It's going to submit the results. And do developers, you know, would they even engage in that? Is kind of a question I have. If you would make it simple enough that even just the fact that kind of having people with one board here, one board there, you know, would we get data from those sources or not? Yeah.
So a couple of thoughts along these lines. One is to help spur the rest of your thinking, is testing is just one form of verification. If we looked at the question, how do we improve our verification process whenever changes get introduced that might reveal other options that we're hiding, that are kept out of sight right now. So I want people to think about that. The second thing is the vast majority of code that we're trying to exercise and make sure isn't broken is just straight logic. It's not dependent on particular hardware, right? We need to capitalize on that. We don't have to run that on board farms most of the time. Get to the very end, yeah. There's huge opportunity there. As a matter of fact, that same functional safety engineer told me another comment, which was his goal is to remove the bugs before the code is written. No, I said before it was run. Before it's all hardware. This is actually before it was written. And I'm still chewing on that, trying to understand how does all that work and how practical is it? It's good food for thought.
So let me just inject one thing. So part of the impetus for me having this discussion is that at the governing board level, we've got this initiative going on to define pillars. And one of the pillars is dependability, and it covers a fairly wide range of things. But the outcome of that is to also try to figure out if from a governing board perspective, the only thing they decide on is what to spend money on. Right. So if there's something around this that we need to spend money on, I'd like to kind of figure it out. So.
Yeah. So like I said, I agree that emulation simulation is very important. But I wanted to say that also the hardware can be very attractive for customers. So for example, if they see like kind of a list, what is already tested, what runs on which hardware, actually on real hardware, this can be also kind of a selling point for them when they like to decide, okay, I'm going to use this platform or that platform. I see its work. It's not only a virtual environment, it's a real hardware working. So I think it's give more confidence in the product that they would like to use.
I think we generally agree that emulation, take advantage of it as much as possible, but we would ultimately still want to be able to run on hardware at some point. So. Wait a minute, ECC's good back here, sorry.
I'm in agreement with everything that you guys are saying. The practical problem I ran into many times, and I'm old, you can tell, is that it runs an emulation, but you put it on the card and it doesn't. With Linux, it was a lot easier because we could modify Linux. With Zephyr, we don't have, we don't have the knowledge to really tweak Zephyr in order to see what's really going on or to fix it. So is there any...
That's what the community's for.
Yeah, but...
And this is what sort of struck me. If you have the capability to import tests run by others, then you've got to deal with the situation of what is a failure. Because it may be their private code that's failing, or proprietary code, or manufacturing. The board may be broke. There is a lot of factors then that come in to what does failure mean. You've got pass is fine. Pass, you don't even have to ask. You might ask what tests they ran to get the pass. But on failure, you can have too many other things.
How would you encourage companies to provide that information?
I think we do need this. We need a way to increase interoperability and dependability.
But are you suggesting that if we were to do something like this, that you would allow them to pass test results for any test? not a test like. See, I've been looking at this from like the Zephyr test suite, right? So you're pushing this out, so you already know that test 32 is this. I think if you're a vendor and you have a custom board and you have a custom test case, the encouragement from the testing working group would be upstream the test, right? So that everybody has this test. If their platform supports it, then great. If it doesn't support it,
proprietary and custom hardware and things that, for example, we've got boards that aren't ever going to be given back to Zephyr.
So custom hardware is, okay, I see that thing. So private stuff or stuff that's secret at that point. I mean, NXP has the same issue in that you're working on a chip, you're doing enablement internally, and you can't upstream it yet because the marketing guys want to be able to stage the whole marketing rollout plan. So that's a kind of a known issue, and you just deal with it. I mean, it's a timing issue as to when you finally do things and upstream and all that kind of stuff. But I think if you've got, like if you have custom hardware, that's a good question. Testing working group, we can work that out.
Yep, we're talking.
Okay, good.
Yeah, I guess I feel like the custom hardware issue is that vendor's issue to deal with, right? It's not, if the community doesn't have access or if there's not a reasonable ability to get access to a board or something, there's no way for the community to reasonably debug that, do anything with it. It's not, that's, the burden is on that company or whoever who's doing that if it's not something that they can make public or accessible. It just,
But maybe if we have to instrument tooling, then maybe that's tooling they can use.
Right, exactly, right. So there's no reason they can't, again, take Twister, run it internally, get the results internally, see what's going on, run the tests that we have, all of that they can do themselves, right? And then it's a burden on them to say, hey, we're finding this bug. Okay, can we reproduce it on maybe something else that silicon's on that is accessible, right? Or so forth. And I think I do think it's an interesting question about like, what does failure mean? And I think there's some interesting places where, we having gone through release meetings, for example, we'll go through and we're triaging the bugs. And there's an aspect where if we go and look and say, okay, is this maybe related to some test? And we can go look at a database that says, oh, this happens to be failing on 50 boards right now, right? Even if we don't know that that's really all 50, maybe it's only 20 of those boards that's failing on, it's still interesting data because then that says, hey, this, we always have this, right, that this isn't a low priority because because what happens a lot of times in that triage meeting, right, someone will report a failure on one board, one platform, and we'll typically say, okay, well, that's low unless we can happen to see a pattern through other bugs getting submitted or something else. And this would give us one way of, quickly, hopefully, if there was enough data to say, oh, we can look and see and say, oh, this is actually not low because it's affecting, a large number of platforms. The other thing I was going to say real quick, which I think between the stuff that Renode or Antmicro showed this morning and to the kind of something Mahe said that I think we should talk to them about it and see is taking the data that they're looking at and trying to see, can we find platforms as we kind of go further with this that are highly, like the coverage, right? That says, hey, if I test on this platform, we from a CI perspective, we're still going to do what we do there. But there's always been this question that says, okay, I've got, 40 different ST boards, maybe that's over, 10 different SoCs. And I'm, am I rehashing the same thing on this, this other board just because it's there, where if I only test it, I only need to test this, one. And so I think the data they're collecting and so forth, it'd be really interesting to kind of be able to sort of see, hey, can we get the minimal set or, of these are the boards, if we test it on, you're going to get a high coverage, you know.
Yeah, I agree. There's Simon.
I just want to add something to Kumar's comment about Renode. We, the safety committee, are in discussion with Renode, so we do. We invited them to do a presentation on next Tuesday, I think. No, it is actually shifted to on Wednesdays, yes, but we shifted it earlier so the testing working group can also join to see their perspective. But I hadn't the time to post it in the testing working group yet. So
Ask if you could record it, that way we can make it available, because I know, like, my guy Hake's in Shanghai, so if it's
yes,
in the afternoon.
no, we shifted it earlier so they can join.
In my defense, I haven't really looked at email in a week and a half because I've been on vacation. So, any other comments here? Because I think we're out of time here. Thank you guys for engaging me. No. Like I said, we're from a governing board perspective, we're trying to understand what a 5-year plan looks like in all these different pillars. Where do we invest? Do we, and all that kind of stuff. So if you guys have any other thoughts about that, then, please pass them my way. I will read my email soon. Thank you very much, guys. Enjoy the rest of the conference.